Last week. Remember anything about last week? If you need a bulletin, raise your hand because we're going to hit that bulletin pretty hard. We're going to look at the review of last week, which is on a different section than normal. And then we're going to look at a lot of passages out of John. And they're recorded there for you in your outline in a rough outline. Last week we talked about Bible study. Remember that? And we talked about, is this on? You guys hear me? Not on. You can hear me pretty, ooh, there you go. That's more gooder. I got a bad word for you in a minute. And bad grammar. I'm going to make Kim go crazy. All right. Last week we talked about Bible study. And got near the end, and I just kind of sewed it up. Then about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it hit me. I didn't hit the last point hardly at all. And that was the whole deal. Last week we had a pretty long week, the week before, and then we were at Camp Christian dealing with 10-year-olds. So I was running on fumes last Sunday. Anyway, I thought this would be a great opportunity to visit that last point. So if you look on your outline, if you look in the bulletin, at the last week's deal, it's on the back page this time. We talked about Into Thin Air. Kind of referenced the 1996 Mount Everest expedition that they lost 8 or 9 guys, 8 or 9 people out of one party, and several people died in that climbing season. And the sentence from one of the guys that wrote about it was, it's hard to have, basically it said, it's hard to have reasonable thought when the air is so thin. No oxygen that high up. And the argument from that fellow was, we shouldn't be using oxygen bottles. It shouldn't be artificial. If you can either climb it or you can't. And if you can't have reasonable thought in that thin air, don't go up. And I kind of tagged it to where I think our society is, that we're into thin air now because we're getting away from Scripture. Scripture used to be a lot more prevalent in our society as a whole, and then in our churches for sure. And so I talked about how we're not having good decisions coming from Washington, from our school districts, from our families, from our churches. We're not having good decisions because we're in thin air. So I talked about the importance of Bible study. And that's where we left last week. But if you'll turn to chapter 20, John chapter 20, and we're going to look at really what John did. John is my favorite gospel. Not by much, but it is my favorite gospel. And what he does, and what I'm going to do off of that, is John presents 8 items for us to look at. And look at chapter 20, verse 30. And if you have a red letter Bible, verse 29, a couple on top of that, they're red, that's Jesus speaking. And then you have John wrapping it up, and he says this: Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, many, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written, why? That you may believe, and if you're with me ever on Wednesday night, that term, believe or belief, just percolates. We look at the life of Christ on Wednesday night, and that group will restart a week and a half from now. But we look at that word a lot. It's like John is presenting these words. These are written. So that's the title of today's sermon. These words. Again, look at your scripture. Verse 31. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. That's the presentation. That's the argument in a court type deal. The Son of God, and that by believing you may have life. We're all alive. We have life. We're sucking in good air and blowing out bad. So we're alive. But there seems to be an element, an artery presentation from Scripture that if you really believe these, if you have this much faith, this little mustard seed of faith, mustard seed grows into a bush, 6, 8 feet, and birds live in that. They exist. They can. If you give God that much faith, and you believe, and you have a disposition to increase that faith, God will honor that and increase that faith. And so John basically, as he wraps up his book, he said, and he did many, many things, but these are written so that you may believe. So we're going to look at these. And the very first one in your outline is it John chapter 2? He changes the water to wine. I don't think Jesus was ready. So I have my file folder here. We're in court now. You're the jury. And we're presenting to you information that will give you enough confidence that you believe what John is presenting to you. So you have Jesus here in John chapter 2. You have Jesus not really ready to start his ministry, and yet his mom asked him to take care of that. John chapter 2, look at verse 6. They're up in Canaan at a wedding, and verse 6. Well, look at verse 5. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. Just do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. I'm not that good in math, but I'm thinking that's 150, 180 gallons of water used for ceremonial washing. And I don't want to be here all day, and I don't want to go too far in the weeds because I want to really get to the point after the last point. I don't want to do today what I did last week. But you have to know, you just have to know this, that by the time they got to the life of Christ, they had taken the law of Moses and had made it this external religion and not a relationship that God is our Father. Not at all. So they believed in washing and ceremony in ridiculous ways. And one of them was that they would wash their hands first, and they would let the water, they would hold their hands up, and would let the water drip down off their elbows. Then they would wash again and hold their hands down. And then they would repeat that 2 or 3 times. So in a somewhat dry area of the world, they're using way more water than what was required by the law of Moses. The law of Moses had a lot of things about hygiene, had washing, but this was ceremonial washing. I don't want to ever be converted to a religion, to a routine. I want to be in a relationship. And I want my discipleship to be following the shepherd, not going through routine. And I've been to churches, you've probably been to them too, where it is just frozen in how we go about church. There's really no, like our order of services doesn't really come out of Scripture. It's just our tradition. We don't worship the tradition. We worship God, and we go about the way we go about. If we change that, it doesn't upset me. It upsets some people. I get that. We like routine. But you don't worship that, do you? They were worshiping this ritual ceremony. Jesus says, take that. Here's my point for this first one. Take that which is set aside for good and make it better, and transform it and make it better. And so Jesus has that ability. Look at verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11. This is the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory. Here's your bottom line. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. So, miracle number 1, presented to you by John. He changed the water to wine. He thus revealed his glory. He's like, I am capable to transform, to set aside to even better. And the disciples, that's the point. Put their faith in him. Say, Greg, I got that. We've heard that before. Look at chapter 4. You know, I don't need to remind you, but I will. You know that Israel's not free at this time politically. They're under Roman rule. And while the Romans were relatively lax on them with their worship, let them go about kind of what they wanted to do religiously, they taxed them in ridiculous ways. They were the political authority. And so Romans weren't liked. They were either disliked or hated. And yet here you have this Roman official. Look at chapter 4, verse 43. Chapter 4, verse 43. After the 2 days, he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So Galilee, got to remind you, Galilee's up north. They're leaving for up north. When he arrived in Galilee, they had been down in Judea, in the southern part. The Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, for they also had been there. Once more, he visited Cana in Galilee, where the water was turned to wine, where he turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick in Capernaum. Capernaum is at the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. 50% Jew, 50% Gentiles, a unique town. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come heal his son, who was close to death. That rubs against some of us, whose son was close to death. That's not fun. Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, you will never what? You won't believe. Till you see it. Till you have something happen in front of you, you won't believe. And it's kind of like a smack. Like unless you see something, how about you just put your faith in me? Jesus replied, verse 49, the royal official said, Sir, there's some respect there. Come down before my child dies. Jesus replied, you may go, your son will live. On his way home, he finds out his son's doing well. He check out the time frame, and it's when Jesus said that. So you have the second presentation. Son is healed. These were written that you may believe in God. Number 3, turn to chapter 5. Right after that passage, chapter 5, verse 1. There's a healing pool outside of one of the city gates of Jerusalem, and the folklore was that when the waters are typically calm, but when the waters are stilled, when they're activated for whatever reason, first one in the water gets healed. So people would hang out there. Look at chapter 5, look at verse 1 to 9. We're going to read that. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, he had been up in Galilee. Now he goes down south to Jerusalem, up the hill, for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda. There is a Navy hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, and it gets its name associated with this passage, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in the condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? That's kind of a no-brainer question. The guy's there. He's trying to get in there. Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes ahead of me. Then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. At once, the man was cured, and he picked up his mat and walked. Now, we have Jessica. She's been in the hospital this time for 5 weeks now? 6 weeks? They say for every 1 day in a hospital bed, it takes 2 days of recovery. And with her system, with the lungs being so poor, her muscles being starved of oxygen, her recovery time is going to be months and months and months. This guy's been an invalid for 38 years. Get up, take up your mat, and walk. I don't know about you. When I have the flu for 3 or 4 days, I'm kind of squishy for a week or so. So there's this healing. So John presents Jesus healing this man who's been lame for 38 years. Gets up and walks. People are going to see that because it's a pool that has lots of people around it. Word's going to get out. Look at verse 16. Yeah, we're going to go back up. Sorry, Mike, we're going to do it. Look, let's go back up to verse 12, verse 11. But he replied, the man, oh boy, we're even going to go. We're going to start at verse 8. We're going to return to verse 8, and we're just going to go down. Then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. At once the man was cured. Is this mic still on too? We need to kill that one too. The day on which this took place was what? The Jews had gotten so, oh boy, that's not good. My lapel mic's not working? All right. You can hear good? All right. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath. That's a spank. That's not good. The law forbids you to carry your mat. Not God forbid that, but the tradition. One of the rules they added, you weren't allowed to walk. They had stupid rules. I've said it before, and I don't want to get too bogged down, but I will. Sabbath day walk. Whatever that amount was, let's say it was a quarter of a mile. You can only walk a quarter of a mile. After that, you're working on the Sabbath. But they came up with a nice little way to get around that. You walk that quarter mile. If you have a stool that has 3 legs on it, remember this? If you have a stool that has 3 legs, like an old piano stool, and you sit on that for a certain long amount of time, an hour or whatever, then that kind of nullifies the walk you already did. So you can walk again. Those kind of ridiculous little rules that man had added, and that wasn't a God rule. That was man had layered that on them. And so they're spanking this guy for picking up his mat, working on the Sabbath. Verse 13. Verse 11, sorry. He replied, the man who made me well said to me, pick up your mat and walk. So they asked him, who is this fellow who told you to pick up your mat, pick it up and walk? The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, see, you are well again. Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you. Verse 15, that's a loaded sentence right there. Verse 15, the man went away and told the Jews, not the general population, the Jewish leaders, that it was Jesus who made him well. He found out. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. Jesus said to them, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. Well, that's going to blow the world up. Daddy, and that term right there, you have Abba, Father, that's Abba right there. Daddy's always working, and I too am always at work. Well, there you go. Now you're saying you're God. So let's see what happens. For verse 18 says, for this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to have faith in him, to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Blasphemy. Yep. So John presents a miracle for you to consider. He's like, Greg, I've heard that before. Well, Jesus is equal with God. Miracle number 4. Look at chapter 6. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Verse 14. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet. If you're looking in your scripture, that's uppercase P. They know what they're saying, who is to come into the world. So John presents yet another miracle for you to look at. And I would say this is kind of like the water to wine. Takes that which is and makes it better. takes what's available, and does what he wants with it. Also, miracle number 5 in chapter 6, if you'll look, he walks on water. Verse 16. After feeding the 5,000 that very day, when evening came, verse 16, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into the boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. There's that town again, half and half. By now it was dark. Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing. The waters were rough. When they had rowed three and a half miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. You know, God has a weird relationship with water. I just wrote some of them down. He separates the water at creation with the land. He separates water. There are springs, apparently, that fed the ground, at least in the Garden of Eden. There might not have been clouds, might not have been rain in the Garden of Eden. There's a discussion on that. Doesn't matter. He used springs. There are springs all over the country, still all over the world. Clouds. God does what he wants with water. Who would think to take tons of water and stick it up in the air by way of heat? And then when it gets so much or changes temperature, it comes down. That's God does weird things with water. The Nile River. Let's just turn this to blood. Moses and the Red Sea. Let's just part it. When they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant across the Jordan River, springtime floods, go down to Mississippi and try to stop the Mississippi River today. That's when they cross the river and the water stops and everybody crosses with the ark. Right? God does what he wants with water. He calms the sea. He uses a fish to illustrate for Peter what God can do. Like, yeah, we owe temple tax. We don't owe it, but we owe it. I don't have to pay temple tax to myself. That's okay. Peter, go the first fish you catch, pull it out. There'll be a coin in there. You pay your tax and mine. God does weird things with water. Here he walks on it. And Mike would tell me he walks on water, but that's ice skating, is what you call that. It's just a loophole. Okay. All right. Next miracle. Chapter what? What's the blind man? Chapter what? 9 and 10. We're going to read a lot of this. So here's what I'm going to do. If you'll stand up, if you are able to stand up easily, take a stand, because I know these pews. Stand up if you can easily. I'm tempted to have you do some Jack LaLanne deals, but I do want you to, so we can go another hour. All right, you may be seated. Elders meeting. Can we read 34 verses? Yeah. Can we do that? Can we treat it? If we were grade school, preschool, we'd have little story carpet thingies we could sit on. Do you remember being in kindergarten? Yes, you. Yes, you do remember. All right, this is story time. The reason I want to read all these passages because this seems to be, in this presentation of John, this seems to be one where there's a pivot. There's a pivot of people that have kind of walked away. Let's see here. Jesus talks about being the bread of life. You read in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, the Word was with God. That. Then you have Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. You must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Now, we're kind of familiar with what that means. But you hear that for the first time. You're following this prophet, this guy who's doing some miraculous signs, and these things are being presented, and you're going home at night, and you're kind of processing, what did I see, or what did I hear? So-and-so was down in Jerusalem, and they saw this happen. But now all of a sudden, this guy who's kind of attractive to follow, like, you have to eat my flesh, drink my blood. At that point, the scriptures say, many disciples left him. And now you come to this miracle, and you have this question that haunts us generations later in 2020. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Well, you think that's a ridiculous question. And it kind of is. But we ask a version of that all the time. Who sinned? His mother or his father? Like, which one of them? Which one messed up? Which Jesus responds, neither. Neither this man nor his parents. I have a friend that lives in Illinois. He and his wife were expecting. They kind of had some trouble with a previous birth, so they were doing pretty good prenatal care, and went to the doctor on Friday, and everything was fine. They're full term. Went to the doctor on Friday, everything was fine. Going to go on Monday to induce and hopefully have a baby on Monday. She woke up Saturday morning, and she just knew the baby was dead. And this is before I knew them. They were going to another church. One of the ministers, they went to a larger church. One of the ministers came to them at the hospital and sat down in front of a couple that just lost a baby and asked that question. And here's the way it was phrased. I'll say his name was Joe. It's not Joe. Joe, who's sinning, you or your wife, that God would take this baby? I'll give Joe a lot of credit, because I probably would have come over and introduced my knuckles. And I'm not joking about that. To his credit and his wife's credit, they healed physically. They kind of healed spiritually, emotionally, but they did not kick God out of their life. And I could tell you that's probably a minority. You go through something like that, and some minister comes, representing God supposedly, and asking that kind of question. And we kind of ask a variation of that, because we kind of believe this equation. Follow me. I'm looking at Joe, so I'm going to pick on Joe Mulak. Joe Mulak, last week, he had a tow motor. He was at work somewhere, and he had a tow motor hit him, and he lays in bed in the hospital up in Westmoreland County, up in Uniontown, and he's like, what did I do wrong? You hear that? What did I do wrong to deserve, surely God is punishing me. And so we have this, what they call this orthodox view of God, that God's in this control room, and he's saying, you know what, I need to get Joe's attention, so I'll have this happen to him. Or Joe was doing this, and he needs to straighten up, so I'll have this happen to him. That God is in some kind of control rooms pushing specific buttons for things that happen naturally. That's physics. You either walked in front of it, or the guy hit you, or the brakes failed on it and it hit you, whatever. There was something happened. There was no necessarily God pushing a button. This child died because it died. It wasn't God saying, you father or you mother sinned. Now, that guy, actually Joe over in Illinois, is a pseudo minister. He's involved in church leadership, and he's come a great way. They have had 3 kids since then. Who sinned that this guy was born blind? How'd this happen? God's getting you back for something. Neither. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life specific. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. So Jesus basically saying, while I'm here, while I'm the light of the world, while it's daylight, while I'm here, let's do something. Night's coming, I won't be here. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, youth groups like this, guys like this, I remember being at camp, and I'd spit, and then the faculty would say, stop that spitting, and I would go right to this verse right here. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, put it on the man's eye. That's a weird way to do a healing. I apologize, but I don't, because that's what he did. That's just a weird way. I would contend to you, a stable out in the field in Bethlehem is a weird way to come into the world too. That's what he did. Go wash under the pool in the Siloam. So the man went and washed. He came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, nah, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I'm the man. No, I was blind. That's me. How then were your eyes opened? He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. That's weird. Told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. That's not going to happen. I present to you, says John, these words are written that you would consider what God has done, what God can do. Consider some of the things that God has done. That's John's presentation in the court of law. Verse 12. Where is this man? I don't know. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Pharisees, you know, part of the religious leaders. They're not real giggy, fun with Jesus. Now, the day on which Jesus made the mud, opened the man's eyes, was guess what day? Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. It's kind of like the second or third time he's saying this. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not